Russian state exports of defense products have hit the $4 billion milestone to the continent.
Russia has just finalized military deals with 46 African nations worth $4 billion, flooding the continent with advanced weapon systems from main battle tanks to air defense missiles. While NATO remains publicly silent, the implications of this massive arms transfer are reshaping the strategic balance across Africa and challenging decades of Western military dominance on the continent. According to Al Jazeera reporting in early November 2025, Russia's state arms export company, Roseburn Export, secured approximately $4 billion in defense product sales across Africa, with contracts now in place with 46 different African countries. The deals include advanced military hardware, ranging from T-90S main battle tanks and BTR-80A and BTR-82A armored vehicles, to S-400 air defense systems, one of the most sophisticated anti-aircraft platforms in the world. The contracts also cover TOS-1A heavy flamethrower systems, Smerch multiple rocket launchers, MSTAU-S self-propelled howitzers, Coronet EM anti-tank missiles, and various models of Kalashnikov rifles. Among the nations receiving these weapons are Rwanda, Uganda, Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Nigeria, and Angola. BBC and Al Arabiya also reported on Russia's massive arms deals with African nations, confirming the scope and scale of Moscow's military export push across the continent. Both outlets emphasize that this represents one of the largest single waves of Russian military sales to Africa in recent history. The New York Times reported that these military deals are part of a broader Russian strategy to expand political and economic influence across Africa, particularly as African nations seek to diversify their international partnerships away from Western powers. The Times noted that Russia has actively courted African leaders through high-profile diplomatic events, including the Russia-Africa summits, with 45 heads of state attending the 2019 summit alone. Beyond arms sales, Russian involvement on the continent includes the deployment of mercenary groups, formerly known as the Wagner Group, and now often referred to as the Afrika Korps, mining interests in gold and diamonds, and sophisticated propaganda operations designed to influence local narratives and public opinion. The scale of Russia's military presence. The $4 billion figure represents a dramatic expansion of Russian military engagement with Africa. To understand the significance, consider what these weapon systems actually are and what they enable. The T-90S main battle tank is a third-generation Russian tank with advanced armor, a 120mm smoothbore gun, and sophisticated fire control systems. These aren't outdated Soviet-era equipment being dumped on developing nations. These are modern, combat-capable platforms that can fundamentally alter military balances in regional conflicts. The S-400 air defense system is particularly significant. This is the same system that caused a major diplomatic crisis when Turkey, a NATO member, purchased it from Russia. The S-400 can engage aircraft, cruise missiles, and ballistic missiles at ranges up to 400 kilometers. For African nations acquiring the system, it means the ability to deny airspace to potential adversaries, including Western military forces that have historically operated with air superiority across the continent. The Smerch multiple rocket launcher system has a range of up to 90 kilometers and can deliver devastating firepower across wide areas. The Coronet EM anti-tank missile is one of the most effective tank killers in the world, capable of defeating modern armor at ranges beyond 8 kilometers. And then there are the Kalashnikov rifles, the ubiquitous AK-47, and its modern variants, updated models with improved ergonomics, optics mounting, and reliability. The 46 nations. While not all 46 nations have been publicly identified, The confirmed participants reveal the geographic breadth of Russia's arms export push. Rwanda and Uganda in East Africa have complex security relationships with their neighbors. The Democratic Republic of the Congo faces persistent insurgencies in its eastern regions. Nigeria confronts Boko Haram and other militant groups across its northeast. Angola maintains historical military ties with Russia and has significant oil wealth to fund defense purchases. The diversity of these nations matters. Russia isn't just selling to traditional allies or ideologically aligned governments. It's building military relationships across the continent, regardless of political system, regional alignment, or historical partnership. This represents a fundamentally different approach from Western arms sales, which typically come with conditions related to governance, human rights, and strategic alignment. Russia's strategic calculation. Russia's $4 billion arms export push to Africa serves multiple strategic objectives simultaneously. First, it generates revenue for Russian defense industries at a time when Western sanctions have restricted other markets. The Ukraine war has demonstrated Russia's military production capacity and combat experience with these systems, potentially making them more attractive to buyers seeking proven equipment. Second, arms sales create long-term dependencies. Once a nation purchases Russian equipment, it needs Russian spare parts, Russian ammunition, Russian training, and Russian technical support. Military officers from African nations train in Russia, creating personal relationships and institutional ties that shape defense thinking for decades. Third, military cooperation provides political leverage. Nations that depend on Russian weapons and support are less likely to vote against Russian interests in international forums, less likely to criticize Russian actions, and more likely to see their security interests as aligned with Moscow's preferences. Fourth, Russian military presence through arms deals, training missions, and mercenary deployments creates facts on the ground that complicate Western military operations. If African nations have Russian air defense systems, Western forces cannot assume air superiority. If Russian military advisors are embedded with African militaries, intelligence sharing with Western partners becomes complicated. Fifth, arms sales support Russia's broader narrative about multipolarity and alternatives to Western dominance. By positioning itself as a partner that doesn't impose governance conditions or lecture about human rights, Russia appeals to African governments frustrated with Western criticism and conditionality. Beyond arms, the Wagner factor. The arms deals cannot be understood in isolation from Russia's broader presence in Africa, particularly the role of the Wagner Group and its successor organization, the Africa Corps. Wagner operated as a private military company that provided deniable Russian military capability in conflict zones worldwide. In Africa, Wagner forces deployed to the Central African Republic, Mali, Libya, Sudan, and other nations, providing security services, training, and combat support. Wagner's business model in Africa combined military services with resource extraction. Putin claimed that Prigozhin made $4 billion from gold and diamond operations in Africa, indicating the scale of economic activity Wagner conducted alongside its military operations. After Prigozhin's death, following his brief mutiny against Russian military leadership, Wagner's African operations were reorganized under Russian military control as the Africa Corps. The Africa Corps continues Wagner's model of providing security services in exchange for resource access and political influence. In the Central African Republic, Russian forces protect the government and train local military forces, while Russian companies extract diamonds and gold. In Mali, Russian military personnel replaced French forces after the Malian government expelled its former colonial power. In Sudan, Russian interests have sought access to Red Sea ports and gold mines amid ongoing civil conflict. African motivations. Why 46 nations said yes. To understand why 46 African nations signed military deals with Russia, it's essential to understand their perspective. African nations aren't passive recipients of great power rivalry. They're active participants making strategic choices based on their own interests. First, many African nations face genuine security threats that require military capability. Jihadist insurgencies across the Sahel, separatist movements, ethnic conflicts, border disputes, and organized criminal networks all require military responses. If Western partners are unwilling or unable to provide what's needed without extensive conditions, Russian willingness to sell without judgment becomes attractive. Second, African nations are deliberately diversifying their international partnerships. Decades of dependence on former colonial powers created vulnerabilities and limited options. By developing relationships with Russia, China, Turkey, and Gulf states, African nations gain negotiating leverage and alternatives. Third, Russian arms are often cheaper than Western equivalents and come with fewer restrictions on use. Russian equipment may not have all the capabilities of Western systems, but it costs less, arrives faster, and doesn't come with human rights monitoring or end-use restrictions. Fourth, Russian military equipment is often more suitable for African operating environments. Russian equipment is designed for harsh conditions, requires less maintenance infrastructure, and can be operated by forces with less technical training. NATO's silent response. What's striking about Russia's $4 billion arms export push to Africa is what hasn't happened. NATO has not issued an official response. This silence is itself significant and reveals the complexity of the situation NATO faces. NATO cannot easily counter Russian arms sales without appearing to oppose African nations' sovereign right to choose their own security partners. Any strong NATO statement risks being portrayed as neo-colonial interference, exactly the narrative Russia promotes. NATO also faces internal divisions about Africa strategy. European members with colonial histories in Africa have different perspectives and interests than other NATO members. Coordinating a unified NATO response to Russian arms sales across 46 diverse African nations would be diplomatically and strategically complex. Furthermore, NATO is primarily focused on European security, particularly given the Ukraine war. Russian military engagement in Africa doesn't directly threaten NATO territory in the same way Russian actions in Europe do. However, the absence of public NATO statements doesn't mean Western powers are ignoring Russian arms sales to Africa. Behind the scenes, Western intelligence services are tracking these deals, Western diplomats are discussing concerns with African partners, and Western military planners are adjusting strategies. The response is happening. It's just not happening publicly. The implications for Western influence. Russia's arms deals with 46 African nations represent tangible erosion of Western military influence on the continent. For decades, Western powers were the primary military partners for most African nations. They provided equipment, training, intelligence support, and security cooperation that shaped how African militaries operated. This matters for Western military operations in Africa. The United States maintains significant military presence through AFRICOM. France still has military forces in several African nations. All of these Western military activities become more complicated when African partners are simultaneously working with Russia. The loss of military influence translates directly to loss of political leverage. For generations, Western powers used military cooperation as a tool for shaping African governments' behavior and policies. Threats to suspend military aid or cancel training programs could pressure African leaders to moderate policies, respect opposition groups, or align with Western positions on international issues. That leverage evaporates when African nations have Russian alternatives that come without governance conditions or political demands. The sovereignty narrative, perhaps the most powerful dimension of Russia's success in Africa, is the sovereignty narrative. Russian engagement is consistently framed as respecting African sovereignty, supporting African agency, and opposing Western interference. This narrative resonates deeply because it connects to authentic African experiences and aspirations. The colonial period remains within living memory. Many current African leaders grew up under colonial rule or in the immediate post-independence period, when former colonial powers maintained significant influence. The sovereignty narrative taps into this historical experience and frames Russian partnership as part of Africa's liberation from external control. Russia positions itself as having supported African liberation movements during the Cold War, providing weapons and training to groups fighting against colonial rule. This historical connection creates a foundation for contemporary partnership that Western powers struggle to match, given their colonial histories. The sovereignty narrative is particularly effective in West Africa, where French influence has been most persistent. France maintained significant military, economic, and political influence in its former colonies long after formal independence. Growing resentment of this continued French influence created an opening that Russia has exploited effectively. When Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger expelled French forces and invited Russian military presence, the moves were celebrated by significant portions of their populations as reclaiming sovereignty from neo-colonial control. The fact that Russian presence involves its own forms of influence and exploitation gets obscured by the powerful narrative of rejecting Western domination. Russia successfully positions itself as liberator rather than new colonizer, even as Russian companies extract African resources and Russian mercenaries operate with minimal accountability. While Russia promotes a sovereignty and partnership narrative, the reality often involves resource extraction that benefits Russia more than African populations. Wagner's operations explicitly combine security services with mining concessions. Russian companies have gained access to gold, diamonds, uranium, and other valuable resources through security relationships with African governments. The Central African Republic provides a clear example. Russian forces protect the government and have helped it regain control over territory. In exchange, Russian companies have gained extensive mining concessions for gold and diamonds. The Kar government benefits from security support, but it's unclear whether ordinary Central Africans benefit or simply experience a different form of external exploitation. Mali presents a similar pattern. After expelling French forces, Mali invited Russian military support. Russian forces now operate across northern Mali, providing counterinsurgency support, while Russian companies gained access to Mali's gold mining sector. Sudan offers perhaps the most brazen example of the resource for security exchange. Russian interests have sought access to Port Sudan on the Red Sea, potentially establishing a naval facility that would give Russia strategic presence along one of the world's most important maritime choke points. In exchange, Russian military support has flowed to factions in Sudan's civil war, prolonging conflict while Russian companies position themselves to exploit Sudanese gold deposits that are among Africa's largest. This pattern reveals the transactional reality beneath Russia's sovereignty rhetoric. African governments trade resource access for security support, creating dependencies that may be different in form, but similar in substance to the relationships with Western powers that Russia criticizes. The sovereignty narrative is powerful and emotionally resonant, but the actual relationships Russia builds involve familiar patterns of external actors extracting African wealth in exchange for supporting African elites. What this means for African security: the influx of $4 billion in Russian military equipment to 46 African nations will have concrete security implications. These weapons will be used in actual conflicts, counterinsurgency operations, and internal security situations across the continent. In some cases, Russian equipment may improve African nations' ability to address genuine security threats. Better armed militaries may be more effective against jihadist insurgencies, organized criminal networks, and separatist movements. However, there are significant risks. Advanced weapon systems can escalate conflicts, increase civilian casualties, and destabilize regional balances. The TOS-1A thermobaric rocket launchers and Smerch multiple rocket launchers are devastating area weapons. In urban environments or areas with mixed combatant and civilian populations, these systems can produce horrific humanitarian consequences. The S-400 air defense systems are particularly concerning from a regional stability perspective. These systems can deny airspace not just to potential adversaries, but also to humanitarian flights, UN operations, and regional peacekeeping missions. There's also risk of weapons proliferation beyond initial recipients. Africa has numerous ongoing conflicts where weapons frequently change hands. Russian equipment sold to one government could end up with rebel groups, criminal organizations, or other state actors. The future of African security architecture, Russia's military engagement with 46 African nations, is reshaping the continent's security architecture in ways that will persist for decades. The post-Cold War era of Western military dominance is ending, replaced by a more multipolar security environment where Russia, China, Turkey, Gulf states, and others compete for influence. This multipolar environment creates both opportunities and risks. The opportunity is greater choice and leverage for African governments. They can negotiate better terms and avoid total dependency on any single external power. The risk is increased complexity and potential for external powers to fuel conflicts rather than resolve them. When multiple external actors provide military support to different sides in African conflicts, those conflicts can become proxy wars that serve external interests rather than African needs. NATO's dilemma. NATO's lack of official response reflects a genuine strategic dilemma. The alliance faces difficult choices about how to engage with Africa without appearing neo-colonial or undermining African sovereignty. One option is competing directly with Russian arms sales by offering African nations better deals on Western equipment. However, this could fuel an arms race that floods Africa with weapons and escalates conflicts. Another option is focusing on non-military engagement, economic development, governance support, and humanitarian assistance. But this cedes military influence to Russia and potentially leaves African nations vulnerable to security threats. A third option is selective engagement, working closely with democratic African partners while accepting that authoritarian regimes will align with Russia and China. This focuses resources where Western values align with local governments, but risks dividing Africa into competing spheres of influence. NATO hasn't clearly chosen among these options, which explains the lack of coherent response to Russian arms sales. The view from African capitals. To fully understand the implications of Russia's $4 billion arms deals, we must consider how this looks from African capitals rather than from Moscow, Washington, or Brussels. For African governments, Russian military engagement represents an opportunity to diversify partnerships, gain leverage in negotiations with Western powers, and address security threats with fewer conditions attached. In Kigali, Rwanda's government sees Russian weapons as enhancing military capability without the human rights scrutiny that comes with Western military assistance. Rwanda has faced Western criticism over its role in Eastern Congo and its domestic political restrictions. Russian partnership provides military capability without accompanying lectures about democracy and governance. In Kampala, Uganda's long-serving government values Russian willingness to provide advanced weapons without questions about political succession, opposition suppression, or regional military interventions. Western partners have become increasingly conditional. Russian partners are refreshingly straightforward about the transactional nature of the relationship. In Kinshasa, the Democratic Republic of Congo's government struggles with insurgencies in the east and needs military capability urgently. Russian weapons arrive faster and cheaper than Western alternatives, without extensive end-use monitoring and restrictions that Western partners impose. For a government facing immediate security crises, these practical considerations outweigh geopolitical concerns about enabling Russian influence. Russia's $4 billion arms deals with 46 African nations represent a fundamental shift in the continent's security landscape. Western military dominance is ending. African nations are exercising greater agency in choosing security partners. The implications will unfold for decades, reshaping African security, Western influence, and the broader global order. The question isn't whether this transformation will happen, but how all parties, African nations, Western powers, and Russia will navigate this new reality. Will increased military engagement from Russia and other non-Western powers improve African security or fuel new conflicts? Can Western powers develop strategies that compete effectively while respecting African sovereignty? The answers to these questions will determine Africa's security trajectory for the next generation and potentially reshape the global balance of power in ways we're only beginning to understand.